Here we go, it's coming back on, and he's back on again. See how he turns?
Turn.
Hi, Jonathan.
Stop the sucking.
Hi.
Good.
Could you
real good.
hear that? Hi, sweetie. Could you hear that? Hi. Hi.
You got that.
So the implant I actually can wear under my hair, but there's a processor here and the microphone's like right here, and it travels electronically to this thing, and this is actually a magnet. So if I take it out, you can see how it's a magnet. And the surgically implanted part is on the inside, so it gets the hearing information gets magnetically transferred across my skull, and it goes to the internal device, which goes into my cochlea, electronically stimulates it, and sends a message to the brain. It's amazing.
That's so cool.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Shayna Cooperman, and I have a cochlear implant in my left side and just a regular acoustic hearing aid in my right ear. I received the hearing aids. I had 2 hearing aids when I was born. I was 11 months old when I was diagnosed, and it turns out I qualified for an implant. Now I can sit in lecture halls without any sort of added microphone, which is called an FM system, and I can hear the teacher just fine. I can hear movies and videos really well. That was always a problem before. So the quality of my life has greatly improved with the implant. Like, I don't know where I would be without it right now. The different types of deafness. There's deaf with a capital D, deaf with a lowercase d, and just hearing impaired. And I'm not fully an expert on this, but as far as I know, deaf with a capital D is basically complete deafness. It's mainly the culture of sign language and like not really using any sort of hearing devices. Deaf with a lowercase d means that you have to use some kind of assistive hearing device, and then hearing impaired means that you have some trouble hearing but you don't necessarily need a device. So I would qualify under deaf with a lowercase d. And it's not that like these different intersections are irreconcilable. I think they are. It's just there has been a lot of animosity between the two, particularly because sign language is not used by that many people. It's got its own culture. It's a beautiful language, and when people don't need to use it, it could die out. It could become archaic, so to speak. So there was a lot of flack against cochlear implants and other things that allowed people to not use sign language.
Well, I think in general, hearing people view the deaf as having a disability, right? Because they can't hear, they're missing part of them. And the deaf community doesn't view themselves that way, and they don't believe that they're missing anything, and they just see themselves as a different culture, and so they use a different language and have different cultural norms. So that's a huge misconception, that a lot of hearing people will go into a conversation with a deaf person feeling pity for them, and the deaf person doesn't view themselves that way.
There's a difference between the cultural and the pathological view of deafness. Culturally, deafness is viewed as a cultural identity, not a disability. Pathologically, deafness is a medical condition that should be repaired.
Deaf people feel very strongly about hearing people imposing their hearing abilities on the deaf community, and they don't see themselves as disabled. They don't think they're missing anything, and so they feel very put upon to have these cochlear implants forced on them.
My name's Emily Stamper. I'm a student at Gallaudet. I'm a Cochlear implant user. I got my implant when I was 2 in 1987. I like how I have the opportunity to be a part of both worlds. And I think that if my parents didn't get the implant for me, I wouldn't be where I am now.
I think I don't really have any involvement with the capital D deaf community, mainly because I just don't know about them. They tend to not be as visible as the lowercase d community because places like this are not necessarily suited for people who don't use speech at all.
I think that building awareness about it is very important because a lot of people just assume that deaf people are using signed English and that everything is the same, the culture, the grammar, and everything. And that's not true. American Sign Language is only one part of the worldwide deaf culture, and there are other sign languages. A lot of people don't understand that. And sign language is so unique. I've heard that it uses a different part of your brain than spoken languages, and it's very visual and spatial, and so the way you use the space around you to communicate an idea is very interesting to me. When I was in sign language in high school, every Wednesday we would take off lunch and our class period and go to a deaf chat at a local mall, and so I got to meet deaf people from the outset in my sign language studies, and it really is a different culture. I got to learn about, their social norms and the way that you structure sentences and questions in sign language. It is really cool. One thing that really strikes me is that this may just be an American thing in general, but we tend not to talk about topics very openly, especially sensitive topics like politics, sex, and religion. And the deaf culture is very open about all those things. Even if they just met you, they'll ask you about your sex life, which is a very interesting thing to have to deal with coming from our more conservative hearing culture.
I have felt a lot of frustration at times, not necessarily at people, but just more because I can't hear. And now, even I do it myself when someone says what, it takes you out of the moment and you have to go back and explain. And so it's just frustrating because you know what it's like to not hear, and you also know what it's like to need to repeat something, and you're just trying to reconcile those two. There's definitely, it's not easy, but it's incredibly rewarding when it works. There are things that hearing people can take for granted that just almost, it could be an annoyance to you guys. When I first heard birds, for instance, I was like, oh my god, what is that? First of all, it was very high pitched and squeaky. I was like, I don't recognize that sound, and I realized it was birds, and I was like, has that always been happening? Or leaves rustling. I'm like, does that always happen? But what's going on? I think it's almost it was more jarring for me because you're going back into what you think is your world, but you realize that there's so much of it that has been going on. That sort of puzzle piece falling into place. I was like, oh, I get it. It makes sense. This is what's going on.
Do you want to give your child this opportunity to hear, but maybe take away part of their culture by doing so? It's an interesting dilemma.
I've thought about this for myself, if I ever have a kid, what would I do? What would I want my kid to have? And for me personally, being deaf has shaped me so much, and if I could do it again, I would do it the same way, because I just got so many life experiences and perspectives and understandings from being deaf. But at the same time, I've been incredibly lucky. I've had access to resources. I've had a family that could give that to me, a family that was supportive and willing to help me. And hopefully, ideally, if I am ever in that situation where I have a child, I too can give to my child what was given to me. But it does take sort of a perfect storm to make a great situation. And so I don't know what I would do if my kid was deaf. I would probably choose sound for sure, because I've experienced it. But I don't know.
But I don't know what I would do if I went deaf. Knowing what I do about the deaf community, I think that I would try an integrated path to give them options in both worlds, because the deaf community is important and sign language is a beautiful language, but at the same time I wouldn't want a child to miss out on the opportunity to hear. So it's a very hard decision to make, and I don't know what I would do if I were in that situation.
When I was born and my mom was trying to figure out, do we want to make her like a verbal baby or a deaf baby, she received a call from one of the capital D deaf centers in the local area, and they were like, no, don't put hearing aids on her, putting hearing aids on her is like changing the color of her skin. It's like a very natural thing, it's something to be proud of in the deaf culture, and I'm glad that my parents gave me hearing aids and introduced me to the wonderful world that is sound, but I do have a lot of respect for that culture, and I think that there's a lot of room for intersection, and I think there's also been a lot of progress in both camps in terms of understanding each other and finding ways to bridge the gap. I don't think it's quite as radical as it was before, so to speak.
The Cochlear implant is still not 100% accepted by the community, but a lot better than it was, say, 20 years ago. Being on campus, now people can walk around and have their implant on, and the other students wouldn't make fun of them or bully them. It used to be that that's not happening. Right now, it's a little bit more acceptable.
I mean, I understand. Well, I can't claim to fully understand what it would be like as a fully capital D deaf person, but I understand what their concerns are from a logical level at the very least, maybe not emotional. And I don't necessarily disagree. Like, I think that it's totally important to conserve the culture, but I do think at the very least that there should be a choice, you know? If the child wants to hear, then like the child should be allowed to hear if they have the opportunity and resources. But like, I feel kind of sad that, you know, someone who maybe is like very stuck to the values of that capital D community, I would feel sad that like they would think that I failed them somehow, because so much of what I'm doing when I like go to school here at USC and I wear my implant and I interact with the community, like so much of what I'm doing is fighting for the right to like be equal with other people, be equal in that, you know, not having a sense, or one of the 5 senses, obviously puts you at a disadvantage. So everything that I do is like pushing, trying to get to this level. So it's sad for me that someone would consider that a failure to them, because I'm like all that work, you know, it's not that I'm necessarily doing it for anyone else either. Like, it's obviously for me, and like I know that I can do it, and I'm pushing myself. But you know, it's just like you want other people to share in the joy, and you want to be an example to them, and you want to get examples from them, and it just feels like there's a divide where I guess there doesn't need to be. I mean, I don't think that like their side is invalid. I don't think our side is invalid. I think it's just like 2 very different ways of looking at the same thing.
I think building awareness about the differences and the importance of preserving the culture is important.
And instead of focusing on the differences, we can focus on the things that make us the same. And there's a lot that makes us the same. I think what's different is